You just got your new EXT Ferro Fork. Let's get it installed and set it up.
Okay, so we're gonna install the EXT Ferro. We're out camping this weekend. We're gonna do it here trailside. And probably most importantly, we're gonna use the same tools that you have at home in your garage. So what do we do to get this bike ready for the setup?
Well, the first thing we've already done, and we did this back in the shop, if you order forks from us, we have a pre-installation kit, and it will make this so much easier. So we're gonna pull this EXT fork out of the box with the pre-install kit already on it. And what that means, we've already pressed the lower bearing on, so you don't have to take it off of your old fork. We'll cut the steer tube so that it fits with very minimal spacers. Important though, you have to have a direct mount stem for that to work.
If it's not a direct mount stem, then we don't need to cut it.
Yes.
Someone can use their OEM stem and be just fine.
Yes.
Okay.
And we've also pre-installed the star nut inside of the steer tube. So the fork will come in the box ready to pull out and mount to your bike without any special tools needed.
Now it's important to note that on Travis's bike, he has a Warp 9 stem lock installed. If you're gonna run this type of setup, we will not install a star nut. The reason we do this service or provide this for someone that buys a fork from us is most customers are used to taking their bike or their fork into a bike shop, like it's a mountain bike, and they get turned away.
And it's important to note that you should not take your Surron or Talaria to a motorcycle shop to have a fork installed, because they are completely different than a motorcycle fork, and they probably don't understand the correct way to install these forks. It's great if you want to take your wheels and have tires swapped and basic stuff like chains that are the same as a motorcycle, but most of this bike is very unfamiliar to them.
Okay, so step one is removing your front wheel and disassembling your fork so that we can get it ready to install the Ferro. After you loosen the cap from your axle, we can then go back and loosen the pinch bolts underneath the fork. The next step is removing any zip ties you have from your front brake cable and removing the caliper from the fork. Now we're going to remove each fork leg individually to keep the whole fork from falling out of the bike. So in this example, we already have the bars mounted to a direct mount stem. We're not going to take the bars off of the stem, we're going to take the stem off of the fork. Now to remove the upper and lower crown, we're going to remove the pinch bolt and the top cap, and it will slide right out.
All right, so with our pre-install kit, what makes it so nice is the bearing comes pre-installed and greased, and there's actually a small spacer with a seal in it underneath there, and on the Talaria there's an additional spacer. All of those are included when you buy our pre-install kit.
So the EXT Ferro Fork is a boost fork, which means this spacer is required in between the rotor and your hub. Now with our installation kit, this is included.
Make sure when you pull your bolts out of your rotor, you're using a very good bit that's not damaged. Make sure it's the correct size. There should be no play back and forth. Sometimes on these star nuts, it's a little tricky to figure out which size is the correct size. Most of the time, these are either 25s or 27s. This is a 25. Don't forget to lock tight. You don't want your rotor coming out while you're riding, which does happen if you forget to Loctite them.
And it's important to remember you have to use the longer bolts included, because that additional depth on the threads is important for strength.
Okay, so we've got our boost spacer behind the rotor. Notice that we've already put our wheel spacer on here because it actually doesn't fit through some of these spacers. So we've put that in first. We've put the spacer and the rotor on top of it. And one last thing, a lot of these rotors are directional, so make sure you find the arrow on there and ensure that you've put it on the correct direction.
Okay, so this is how your fork is going to look out of the box. In this example, we've already cut the steerer tube and the star nut is already installed, as well as the lower bearing grease that you can see. In this example, we're removing the fork legs so that we can have a cleaner install.
Be sure to clean any dirt off of your bearing surfaces and your head tube, because these bikes often have a lot of dirt in them. So now we're going to insert the lower triple. And notice we've already pre-greased the bearing. I'm holding the bottom triple so that it doesn't slide back out, and now I'm installing the top.
All right, Brian, so an important note here. We get a lot of questions asking, why is my headset wobbling back and forth? We see a lot of forks installed wrong.
Yes.
So it's important to note that the spacers we're reusing from the prior fork do not fit this. So we have to use the proper spacer because the spacers have to be taller than the steerer tube. So this rule applies whether we're using a star nut or a stem lock. The spacers need to be a couple millimeters above the steerer tube. Okay, so now when we install the top cap, when that gets tightened down, it keeps the whole headset tight.
So when you're tightening this, you don't want to He-Man crank this on. What's important is to feel the tension in the bearings. So if I go too much, this gets stiff. And if I back it off just a tad, it freely moves, but there's no play in it. Notice that we have not tightened the upper triple yet. First, we want to install the stack. We want to tighten and put tension on it first. Then we're going to put a fork tube in here to align this properly, and then we will tighten the upper triple.
Now, before we move too far ahead, if we get questions about where can I get these spacers, if you need those, they're pretty readily available, pretty much anywhere.
And we sell the Wolf Tooth brand on our website if you're looking for them.
Now we can go ahead and install the stem back on the upper crown. So now we've attached our stem back to the upper crown. It's important to remember your brake cable routing. So this is both the throttle and the rear brake going through in between the fork tube and the frame. Now at this point, because it's a little bit easier, we're gonna go ahead and install our fender back onto the lower crown. Remember to use at least one drop of blue Loctite because those will vibrate out.
So gently slide the fork tubes up. Chances are that your upper and triple clamp will be misaligned, and you can just simply correct that with your hand and get them aligned. And now see how easy the fork tube slides up and down. I'm not using any pressure to do that. Okay, so this is where we can adjust the geometry on your bike, and you can actually play with this and move your fork tubes up and down in the triples. If you have a zero stack, you have a lot more room to do this. With the Surron puck in here, you lose about a ½ inch, and you're probably gonna run your fork tubes all the way down so that they're basically even with the top. I've left, I don't know, I think that's about 3 millimeters gap. So the tubes are up about 3 millimeters. And if you drop them down, it relaxes the bike, better for downhill, better for high speed. If you suck the fork tubes up, you're lowering the front end, which makes it turn quicker. So for tight technical terrain, you would want to move the fork tubes up. Now that we have the fork tube in, we can tighten the upper triple on the steer tube. On triples that have 2 bolts like this, it's really important to alternate back and forth. So tension, go up, tension, go back down, tension. That way you're tightening this up evenly and you won't risk stripping any bolts. Okay, a lot of people ask us torque settings for these bikes. On the EXT Ferro Fork, the top pinch bolts are 9 Newton meters. The lower pinch bolts are 6 Newton meters. And on the axle, it's also 6 Newton meters.
Okay, so I love it when a company thinks about the smaller details. In this case, EXT is obviously a premium fork. They've thought of everything. We're installing the fork decals now because you can't do it after you put your zip tie on. They gave 2 sets of decals. The zip tie just fell out, so they thought of that as well, including these small touches that keep everything super clean for a brand new install.
I'm just gonna put this on temporarily while I mount the brake. And one important thing to note, your brake cable goes inside towards the wheel, not on the outside. If you have a brake adapter, there's always an up side, and this, so make sure that's up, and we're going to install it this way. Notice that there's 2 different length bolts. The long one is going to go on the top because it's got a thicker spacer than the bottom. You always want to grease your axle. One, it helps you install it a little bit easier, but it also keeps water out of here and can help prevent any type of corrosion or stiction happening for someday when you want to pull this back out. Another feature to point out on the EXT Ferro is both ends are hexagon in shape, and the reason for that is a common problem with upside down forks, especially mountain bike upside down forks, is while you're riding, they're not stiff enough in the lower to prevent the fork tubes from twisting. We've experienced that. I've almost gone over the handlebars on a Surron before because I was going fast in technical terrain, made a turn, the tire twisted and put me over the trail. Almost had a bad crash. So this will help prevent that and keep your upside down forks less twisty. Is that a good way of saying that? We've kept the brake caliper loose in here so it's free floating because we don't know where we want it yet. And I'm going to lift the wheel up, align the rotor into the caliper, and try not to knock the spacers off of the hub. There we go, just like that. Now this axle can only go in from one side, so you're going in from the, if you're on the bike, the right side of the bike, you'll see on the other side, there's actually no opening there. There's a Allen head bolt to pull the axle in. And it is a hexagon shape inside the lower, so you've got to get that aligned before you can push it through. So one thing to note, this is the air spring side, this is the damper side. The damper side can move up and down fairly easily. It is slightly longer on the damper side than the spring side, so you're going to want to put some upward pressure to get the correct alignment to push the axle through. It's now time to tighten it using the 5mm wrench. When you're tightening this, you do want to make this fairly tight. That'll help tighten up the wheel, prevent any movement and twisting. So one thing you'll notice about this setup that I really love is different than especially the OEM forks. There's no like question of left and right and balancing the axle inside the lower. It's all perfectly aligned, it's perfectly tight, and now I'm ready to just tighten the pinch bolts. Now once again, I'm going to go back and forth. I'm going to tighten one and then go to the next, tighten it.
Now, a few finishing touches here. Just putting on the number plate. Then I'm going to remember to use my zip tie, which we've already put on, and snip it down. That way we're good to go. Okay, so because this is an air fork, and you're gonna use the guide to set it up, it's important that you don't throw away the fork pump that comes in the box. It's awesome that they included this. It's one less thing that you have to buy. We will use this to go through our complete setup guide to put the correct pressure in for your weight and riding style. Okay, so the bike's all set up. Let's go ride.